Good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of food safety, producing awesome food products, keeping everybody safe, making sure that food that we all eat as people every day is safe and wholesome. And we appreciate it. So I always like to take the time here at the chat to thank you for that. And I know that Shawn echoes that sentiment as well. So first off, welcome. This is the Food Safety Chat, and my name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And if you're new to the chat, every week, what we do at this time, so 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern here in the United States, is we have a conversation around food safety and food quality and all things that kind of circle around that. Because as you know, food safety is not a point of competition. And what's really cool about the chat is every week I get to bring on an expert in this area and have a conversation. And the best part of that conversation is you, because we love responding to the comments, the interaction. It's just absolutely amazing. So with that, if you're a regular on the chat, you're going to be excited because we have Shawn Stevens with Food Industry Counsel on board today. Shawn, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you today?
Oh, not too bad. Not too bad. I'm always happy to get Shawn because he is a busy dude and it's not easy to get him scheduled. So we're always very appreciative when you're here, Shawn. So thanks.
Absolutely. So happy to be here again, talking about issues that are continue to be some of the most pressing in the industry, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it's the interesting piece of what we do, but it's also the challenge in what we do because everything is constantly changing. And if you think what you did 5 years ago, or maybe even 2 years ago is going to be sufficient, odds are you're going to be in for a rude awakening. So we're glad that you're here and investing your time to learn more about this and figure out how you can apply these things to your activity. So one of the things that we love to do here on the chat, and Stephanie has got in here first. Good afternoon, Stephanie. Stephanie's in beautiful Germany, so always nice to see you, Stephanie. So one of the things, everybody, that we love to do, and I'm always amazed, Shawn, these different locations. So we have Stephanie in Germany. I'm in Loveland, Colorado. And Shawn, where are you at in the world today?
Today I'm in a small town called Random Lake, Wisconsin.
Beautiful. And we were just talking a little bit about the weather before we got on here. It's been relatively mild here in Colorado. Currently, it's about 23 degrees Fahrenheit, so roughly 5 below or so C. How's your weather looking there?
We're a little chilly today. We're probably mid-20s Fahrenheit. Hoping it would be a little warmer to melt all the snow we got in the last couple of days off the driveway because I haven't pulled out the shovels yet. May have to wait for a few more days, but it's tolerable. It could be much worse.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And how good to see Robert and Kimberly. Nice to see you as well. Thanks for joining us here today. So one of the things, everybody, we love to do on the chat to get things started is join us, please, for a ceremonial sip of your favorite beverage. Cheers.
Cheers.
Ah, very nice. And in case people didn't notice here, I got to point it out because I'm so proud of it. This is the year of the dragon, right? So the Chinese Lunar New Year started here over the weekend or last weekend. And so I have this really cool dragon on my desk now. So technically it's the wood dragon, I believe. So for this year. So that's my little nod to that. And so
you were the dragon.
And it's a Lego dragon. You can't really tell from this distance, but it's really cool. I have a nephew who loves building all these different Lego toys. And it's amazing, all the different kits and things that you can do with this. And the other side of it is, oh my God, they're expensive. Holy moly.
And they hurt when you step on them with bare feet.
That is very true. So with this, let's kind of dive into our topic here today. And this is kind of a timely one. And I think I put together a title on this. So one of the things for people who are new to the chat that we do is we'll have a prep call earlier in the week to kind of go over a topic. And Shawn is definitely cutting edge relative to the different topics of what's going on in the food industry. So these conversations always kind of start around the lines of, all right, what are you seeing out there, Shawn? And immediately recalls, right? What's going on with recalls and these type of things. And I titled our chat here for today is, you're guilty until proven innocent. And definitely anybody who has been through a recall feels that way. Wouldn't you think so, Shawn?
Yeah, absolutely. Recalls are obviously a real thing in the food industry. They're in many ways sort of a part of doing business, but I think there's a lot of problems in the overall system. And if we listen to FDA talk about their view of the world or USDA, the problems that the agencies would identify is speed from identification of a problem to execution of the recall. And I think we'd all agree, to the extent we're most interested in protecting the public health, which should be our priority in all cases, that is important. But if you ask for the industry perspective as to where the problems exist, there's a lot of disconnect amongst the folks at the regulatory level who are managing sort of the recall process from the government side, and not having the intimacy or the understanding or experience in what it means and what it's like to try to run a business or run a company, preserve jobs, and feed consumers. So it's really easy when a government regulatory agency believes there might be a problem to very quickly jump to a conclusion in an attempt to solve that problem, demand that recalls be announced or executed as fast as humanly possible, and maybe at the expense of making a mistake, right? Where that company is ultimately forced to go out of business or lose lots of customers or be accused by plaintiff lawyers of causing illnesses that it never caused. So I think there's also, this is very, very high level thematic and we can get in the weeds, but there's also a disconnect amongst the various regulatory bodies at both the state level and then also the federal level. And I think overall, it can create a lot of confusion when we sort of are operating in this recall space. Is there an issue? If so, how broad is it? Does it require action? If so, what type of action? And then how quickly? And these are all issues we continuously grapple with. And I guess I'll just say, to kind of conclude my opening summary here, I know the FDA will be spending a lot of time in the coming months working on trying to just do that, streamline this recall process. But again, I'm fearful of the negative consequences that may result, because we may be rushing or forming a system where we're more likely to rush to judgment and get it wrong.
Right. No, and that's a really good point. After the recall is done and the dust is settled, FDA is still going to be there. The company may not, right? So there's definitely a differential associated with the amount of pressure under this particular instance. FDA deals with these things all the time. And so from a governmental perspective, they're like, hey, what's the big deal? Just, get the product, get it out of the market and everything else. Right. For the company, it's a life or death situation a lot of times. Their business is at stake. Everybody's jobs are at stake. They may not even be guilty. And we'll go into that a little bit later on some real world examples of this happening. And so recalls are not as cut and dry from the perspective of what we see. From their perspective, they see it as a simple process. And we're seeing out in the marketplace, and it's very interesting, is because when people are inside FDA, for example, Shawn, they're very limited on what they can say publicly and things like this. But once they leave that body, well, now they can be a little more outspoken. And we're seeing some of the criticisms from Frank Yanis relative to this recall for the applesauce and the different things that are going on with that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But from what I've seen from Twitter and other posts from Frank, he's being very candid on this and saying, hey, listen, there's multiple points of failure here, and you can't pass the buck. And he's right from that perspective. So I wrote down here on this list, and so part of this, and really the conversation is, and this is, I think, for everybody who's listening today, a huge advantage, because Shawn deals with these issues every single day, and as head of quality assurance for major food companies, I have dealt with these from the viewpoint of food safety as well, and going through Class 1 recalls. So you guys are going to be getting some real world examples of how these type of things apply and the lessons that we've learned relative to these. So as we're going through this conversation, if other people have points in here that you can add to this, definitely please put those in the comments so we can add those into the conversation. And welcome everybody else who's joining us as well. So Richard in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I live there, beautiful area. And as Richard knows, I'm very sure it's not Lancaster, right? You'll get corrected on that very quickly. It's Lancaster. And that always cracked me up. Steve, Megan, and of course, Austin this morning. Good morning, everyone. So here's some of the examples, Shawn, that I've seen from the real world, and we'll dive into these right away because we have just a ton to cover here today. Is that the recall system that you have is not properly set up, and this is the important part. It's not practiced. I think a lot of times, Shawn, people think that simply doing a product traceability exercise, every year we do the one forward and one back thing, and we're good. We're prepared for a recall. And I think that's the number one mistake companies make. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I was on site with the client a number of weeks ago, and we did exactly that, a traceability exercise. We're helping them get ready for SQF certification, and they were able to come back in about 14 minutes with the with all of their traceability information for the particular product that was selected. And that's fabulous, and congratulations are owed. But what isn't practiced, to your point, is the 24, 48, 72 hours, right, on the left and right of that exercise, trying to determine whether there's an issue and whether the product needs to be withdrawn or recalled. And when, the information starts to come in most cases, if we're talking about let's use an example. People are reporting hard shards of plastic in an ice cream product. Okay. Well, is it, and maybe the ice cream products are packaged in clamshells. And is it that the clamshells got brittle and broke and is really more of a quality issue, or is there something more, something worse going on where the product is actually becoming contaminated? And, the first one or two complaints in, let's say, the month of March may not look like a whole lot, but then you get maybe 3 or 4 more in the month of April. And now we start asking ourselves, well, is this a problem? And if so, what's the root cause? And maybe we don't know. Are these legitimate complaints or just consumers, something happened in the household? But what if it is real? And, we shipped 4 million units over this period and we're only seeing 5 complaints. But, God forbid a small child eats one of these. If there is an issue, lacerates his or her throat, ends up in the hospital with severe complications or worse. And then what does that liability look like? And what do we do? And if we did decide to recall, how much product? We're looking at, 2 months worth of complaints. And that's sort of on a more macro level. On a micro level, what if we get a call from one of the agencies saying, hey, we're investigating a cluster of illnesses caused by listeria, and of the 35 confirmed case patients, 4 of them are reporting exposure to your product. Well, is that significant or not? And I would say probably not, but depending on the product and how novel it is, maybe it is. So I think in these exercises, it's super important to create as you described, the fictional scenario where we bring the leadership group into a room and say, okay, it's day 1. This is the information we just learned from, I don't know, our complaint line or customer telephone number. And now it's day 2, and this is what we learned. What are you going to do? What's your decision-making process? Or if the agencies are involved, what questions are you going to ask and push back? Are you going to request a telephone conference with the CDC? And if so, can you get it? I think it's more likely nowadays, but still there's, delay. And then if you do get that opportunity, they've got 100 data points, but they may only want to share 2 of them with you. Right. And now what are we supposed to do? So those are all the things that it's important, I think, to work out on the front end before you get to the, okay, now we're going to execute our 14-minute traceability exercise.
Right. Yeah, there's a ton to unpack there. And as Stephanie says here, and she's 100% right, once the data is there, then that's when the real work starts, right? The traceability exercise, and I hammer on this all the time, that's just a teeny tiny little piece of your overall system of what you need to be looking at. You need to do a recall simulation, not a traceability practice, 100%. So in what you said, there's some major things to unpack here. Is number one, this issue is going to happen at the wrong time. It's going to be a Friday at 4:30 p.m. The CEO's on vacation. You're the only one in the office before Christmas, and you get a call from Florida, right, or FDA or whoever, saying, "Oh, hey, we have this issue, and we think that you need to recall." And you have number one, very limited data, right? And so this is something I always teach people when I'm going over this type of recall activity. Is your information at a given point in time during this crisis situation is limited. You're never going to have the entire picture. And to your point, Shawn, is FDA is also, even if they're sharing information, is probably going to be redacted. You don't know the person, you don't know the contact information. They're blocking out information. It's very, very limited. Do I have a pattern here or not? And it's extremely important. If you get one thing out of this chat here today, I'm going to underline this and emphasize this. You need to be looking at this process in 2 different steps. And Shawn is talking about this as well. Is number one, is determining if you actually have an issue. There's going to be enormous pressure on you. And let's say that you're in this recall coordinator role. Enormous pressure to start the activity. Oh God, we need to recall immediately. Do we? Do we actually have an issue? Being able to have the discipline to be able to sit back and start evaluating the information that you have is absolutely critical. Because if you decide to recall and you don't have an issue, too late. The horse is out of the barn. You have a recall now, whether you like it or not. And it may not be needed. It may not even be your problem. So to Shawn's example, a consumer accidentally breaks a package in the fridge and gets some plastic fragments from the packaging into the ice cream and thinks that the manufacturer did it. No, it was the consumer that did it, but you don't know that at that point in time. And let's say that you change packaging and there's a brittleness to that packaging that causes a couple other issues. Maybe that's what's going on. You don't know. And so to be able to then pull together this information and start looking at it is very, very important. Once you decide that you do have an issue and it's like, okay, yeah, we do, and we need to start the process of recall, that's a separate decision-making process that needs to be carefully evaluated.
I think I just want to add, because I don't want to forget, so it's important to have the leadership group all sitting at the table and going through these types of exercises so that they can experience what it's like to have to make those very difficult decisions.
Yeah.
And then when the real world scenario, and there comes a point in these exercises where we can kind of build in where, okay, now it's, we're at a point where maybe there isn't a right answer either way, but we're in a position we can answer the question and then execute on that. Right.
Right.
And it's so when they get to the real world scenario, they've been armed and they have the experience, right, in the back of their mind of having done this before, and the group will know, okay, they'll already be sort of oriented in where we need to get. And
right.
Once you get there, everybody will be comfortable and you won't be paralyzed. But the point I wanted to make was, in the context of those conversations, sometimes when the decision to actually pull the trigger and recall product is made, companies will have a tendency to try to downplay the significance of the issue, either in their correspondence with the regulatory agencies or in their press release or recall notice to the public. And what can happen is, and there are cases where we work and we try to influence FDA to have a particular recall characterized as a class 3, because maybe the risk to consumers is low. It isn't a huge issue. Doesn't need to go to the consumer level. But depending on the size, there are certain insurance policies out there that say they will only cover, they only provide recall coverage for a class 1 or maybe a class 2 recall, or a recall that's reasonably likely to lead to bodily injury or harm to consumers. So sometimes companies get themselves they maneuver themselves out of insurance because they use the wrong words when speaking to the regulators or in their press release, and it could cost them $2 million. So it's important. I just wanted to get this in there because it is so important. I didn't want to forget it, but it's important as part of those exercises to also then work in, okay, what are the insurance consequences depending on the action we take and how we phrase it to the agencies and the public.
Wow, that's a super important point. And you need to understand within your organization, number one, to kind of reflect this back, do you have recall insurance? Right? And check with a lot of times this works through the contract division. So it may be through your legal group. A lot of times it's within the finance group within the company. Do we have recall insurance? And if we don't, we need to get it. And then to your point, what does it actually cover? You need to, think about your own life. All right, you have car insurance. Do you have just basic liability, or do you have a higher level of coverage? Is that going to be necessary? And what's that correct level associated with that? You need to figure these things out. A lot of companies in the past have been burned by that because these are huge settlements with the insurance company. As we all know, insurance companies don't like to pay out millions of dollars if they don't have to. So if there's any type of an out, they're going to look for that loophole. So this then goes back into making sure that your system is robust. And I think this kind of segues into this comment as well. So I'm guessing this is Jose's comment here. So there are elements in the food system that impact the extension of the recall. Clean breaks. Oh my goodness, right? And so this kind of gets into your point too. Number one, the first thing FDA comes in, and we're jumping ahead now to an actual investigation, is one of the first things that FDA is going to be looking for are jump in the wall, I refer to it. So you have CIP, you have production, and then you have another CIP. Is there anything with that affected product that is potentially impacting other runs? Is there cross-contamination with other products? Is there rework in your process that is being added back into that product? And a lot of times, when you see a recall that's announced and it says XYZ company is recalling this product and there's 5,000 pounds and return it and blah, blah, blah. Then a week or so later, you see another announcement from that company that says recall from this company has been expanded and now 100,000 pounds is being recalled. That's because FDA has identified problems in that system, or the company identified this during their investigation. And it's like, oh crap, right? We have a lot more here. And your credibility as a company and the robustness of your system just went way down because now the consumers don't trust you, FDA doesn't trust you, and your data is going to be questioned. You have to be sure up front.
And, I don't want to get into too much inside baseball here, but when we look at, I'd say a fairly significant number of recalls, in many cases, we won't ever necessarily know what the root cause was. And what I'm referring to is recalls of products because of pathogen contamination. If we find, or let's say a regulatory agency we're making deli salad, they pull a sample at retail, they tested it, test positive for Listeria. They let the company know. They've got, product ID, the lot number, all this stuff. We can trace it back. We know the day and the time. Then the question becomes, well, was the contamination a result of a manufacturing error, an employee who maybe dropped a utensil on the ground and then picked it back up and used that utensil, which was now likely contaminated with Listeria, to pack additional deli salads, which would be good news if we had evidence of that, because then we could limit the scope of the recall to a single shift or a single batch. But what if it was really caused by one of the ingredients that was added, like spice? And in some of these cases, the advice I give to clients is there is rarely anything such as certainty in this business. But the standard we need to try to get to is what was the most likely cause.
Yeah.
It's reasonably likely that this contamination event was caused by employee error. Here's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be, right? Because we just don't have the capability in many cases to go back and, sample all of the raw materials that were used. And sometimes companies may be incentivized to find that manufacturing error so they can limit the scope, when in fact, if it was an incoming ingredient and there was no lethality, you could be talking about, rather than a $250,000 recall, a $25 million recall because of where all those raw materials were used. So there's also, I just point this out as, one of the, I guess, weaknesses in the system, which is in some cases, we're just not able, put the regulators aside. We as industry sometimes aren't able to figure out whether the issue that we're seeing was caused by A or B.
Yeah, exactly. And so a couple of key points to pull out of there that I got from that is, number one is you need to be evaluating your risk associated with your product and your control of that product in the manufacturing environment. So let's say, for example, you're making a ready-to-eat granola bar, and you're just taking this granola bar. It's a cold press process. There's no kill step, and you're creating these bars, and then you're packaging them and selling them. You're extremely dependent on your supplier's controls, and you need to think about that and up your supplier testing programs. So, okay, fine, you're getting COAs from your suppliers, but for high risk ingredients, you may want to have your own testing program as well to try and limit the damage associated with that. The other point that was interesting in what you were talking about in your example was deli meat, right? So a lot of contamination of deli products occurs at the store level, right? You got the 18-year-old kid who's operating the meat slicer and not cleaning it. And you're getting cross-contamination between these products, and your product got caught up in this recall. You may never find that out, right? So you need to have those robust programs in place to try and make that as simple as possible. Now,
I'm sorry, Bryan, if I could, I don't want to tear our agenda apart, but as to that point, and I think it's important because it does tie into what we're talking about. I recently, and I think we're going to see this more frequently, I recently had an experience with a client who ran basically a deli operation. It was a grocery chain. And what we're seeing now is the state, also feds, but more increasingly the state regulatory bodies are really digging into genome tracker and the WGS database.
Yeah.
To identify connected cases. And we had an instance where a cluster of a handful of individuals, clinical isolates, were all located in a particular geographical region. Mm-hmm. Once interviewed, and it was the WGS that set off the light with this particular state health department. After interviewing those case patients, they learned that they had all purchased products from a particular grocery store, and they actually went in and did sampling and testing and found the offending organism. Mm-hmm. So I think increasingly at the consumer level and retail, we're seeing WGS being used. And that was one of those, I didn't buy it at first because it was just so novel, and it was only a very small number of cases, and people are exposed to stuff all the time, and it was limited to one store allegedly, and it just didn't make any sense. Yeah. Organism was salmonella in that case, but resulting from poultry handling. So the raw poultry contaminated the environment, which then led to products being contaminated. Yeah. Wow. So not even listeria, but so, just as consumers, I guess it's good news, but as those of us who work with companies like you and I, we should be letting everybody know, be aware that the WGS is getting so good now that these tiny clusters are being identified and solved, which is going to create more of an incentive for us to do these exercises, right? Yeah. in our own organizations.
Right. And yeah, we'll circle back to whole genome sequencing here at the end relative to Shawn's thoughts around do or don't do. So now in that scenario, and this is a really good, I'm glad you brought this up, Shawn, is this very much ties into what we're talking about relative to time, because there's going to be a variance here. You're going to find out a potential issue. And even if the state agency is on top of this and they're getting samples and they're out there aggressively investigating, there's still going to be a differential between when you find out and when the regulators find out that's this additional piece of information. And that pressure on you to recall in that period of time, even ahead of that, is going to be enormous. And you may end up having that recall anyway, because later on the state says, oh, hey, by the way, we found out the actual source. It was the retailer, not the manufacturer. Sorry, right? Well, damage is done. So back to our, kind of scenario here is figuring out, do I have a recall or not? And practicing that. You have to practice everything that we're talking about here today. You can't write down procedures, throw them in a book and say, okay, awesome. Once we have a recall, I'll just pull this off the shelf and everybody will know what to do. Completely wrong. Completely wrong. I know this from very painful real world experience. Is when a recall happens, number one, this is one of the worst things that a company can go through. People are going to panic. And if you don't give people instructions on what to do, they're going to act on their own. And in particular, kind of the example I use on this is your sales team. Your sales team, in most cases, are isolated. They're out in the field. They're working with their clients. They're nowhere near you. And all of a sudden, they hear about these recall situations of, oh my goodness, my company is having a recall. And they get a call from their customer, the retailer, and saying, hey, Shawn, what the hell's going on with your company? What can you tell me? What can you tell me? It's not in human nature for that salesperson to go, well, I don't know. I'll get back to you later. No, they're going to make something up, right? They're going to, oh, no, I'm sure this is all fine. This is all taken care of. We really don't have a recall. Nothing to worry about. It's all good. They have no clue, right? So you need to work with those people and all these different groups in advance to train them on how to respond to these type of situations and say, give the correct response. Because if you don't, it's going to damage your mechanism. And once you actually initiate the recall, those communication channels of how you're working with FDA and media and retailers and consumers and all these type of things, it's going to be an absolute deluge, and you need to be prepared for that. Here's an interesting one that I learned as well. Is once you reach that Rubicon and you initiate a recall, and this is something that's really hard for companies to understand, and I'll sit down, if I'm in charge of quality assurance for a company, I will sit down with the CEO, Shawn, and go over all these type of things and explain to that person that they're not in charge during the recall. And part of the reason I do that is I want to gauge their reaction. How is she going to react to my comment? And their next thing that they will rationally say is, well, okay, Bryan, I hear what you're saying. What do you mean? Everything in the company, if you're having a recall, stops. Nothing else matters. You're in survival mode for your company. Next week, marketing promotion doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. The entire organization needs to turn its focus, and all the resources in that company need to turn to resolving that recall as quickly and correctly as possible. And the recall coordinator needs to have the entire resources of the organization at their disposal. They need to be able to direct everyone on what they need to do. And there's some other things that need to be in place too, and we'll kind of talk about those as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have either the final decision maker or the person who makes the final recommendation for approval to be that person with experience, who is a recall coordinator, who has a food safety or food science background, or who has access to people that can assist in making that decision-making process. And then when the ultimate recommendation is made, the company can execute on it. I remember hearing Frank Giannis tell a story about right after he left Disney and started at Walmart, arrived in Bentonville with his wife, and hadn't even unpacked the boxes yet, and says, we caught wind that there was an issue with one of our food products, and I had to make a decision on the first day of the job about whether or not to recall this product. It's going to cost the company $12 million. And I reached out to the CEO and said, this is what we have to do. And he said, are you sure? And I said, yes. And as soon as I hung up the phone, I looked at my wife and I said, don't unpack the boxes. I don't think I'm going to be in this job very much longer. And it all worked out. But it's so important that the person who's making that decision is the person who's the best suited to make the decision from a food science, food safety, and public health standpoint. Craig Wilson, another example, who was with Costco, is retired, but is still very active in the industry, would say, I report directly to the CEO, and when I say this is what has to happen, that's what happens. Right. So to the extent we can build that culture in an organization, I think at the end of the day, it can be extremely helpful. So it's a really great point, Bryan.
Yep. And Jose points out here as well, is there's little details, and this again goes back to practicing, that you need to remember. So for example, the requirements under GFSI versus regulatory requirements for recalls are different. And one of those points in there is with GFSI, like we'll use SQF as an example here, is you are required, if you're having a recall, to notify within 24 hours. And there's a special email set up for these type of things, that you're having a recall. And if you don't do that, they can yank your certification, right? So you need to think about these little details as well. That also brings into account, and this is something that is incredibly important, is you need to build out your support network. If you're the recall coordinator, you need to build out your support network in advance of a recall. So you may have an in-house counsel at your company. Well, guess what? They're dealing with contracts, and they're dealing with mergers and acquisition. They're dealing with business activities associated with legal. Odds are you don't have a dedicated food safety lawyer in your company. Most companies don't. What they have is outside counsel that assists, hence people like Shawn, who are experts in food safety. If I'm having a recall, the last thing I want to do is have to pull up the internet and start searching for food safety lawyers and call Shawn out of the blue and say, hey, you don't know me, but I'm having a crisis. And Shawn's be like, what? Okay, well, I'll do what I can, but who the hell are you? And what do you make? And where are you? You're starting from ground zero. Versus building that relationship in advance and saying, hey, Shawn, I'm Bryan, I work with XYZ company. Love to start putting together systems around recall and have outside counsel for this. And you can begin that discussion in advance. I want to be able to pick up that phone 24/7, get a hold of Shawn's firm, and know that I'm covered. So you need to have food lawyers. You need to have media. Media communication. This is something where companies fail a lot, is what's your messaging? How are you going to communicate to your consumers? How are you going to get out press releases to the media? Do you have a dedicated website set up that you use for recalls that you can direct consumers to? If you need to increase your consumer responses, because a lot of times within companies, you have 2 or 3 people who are dealing with consumer complaints and they call the 800 number. Well, guess what? During a recall, hundreds or thousands of people are going to be calling for information. How are you going to handle that sudden increase in traffic? Testing labs. What external testing laboratories do you have, and what expertise do they have? So like, for example, Dr. Marshall at Eurofins, microbiology experts that you can call on to help you. Process authorities. If you are producing low acid canned food or other type products that fall under LACF regs, do you have access to a process authority? All of these type of things need to be set up in advance, and you need to think about these.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that, Bryan, there's sort of two buckets. The first bucket is, what experts might I need in the midst of the sort of making the recall decision, right? Now we may have a crisis. What experts can I rely upon to help answer the questions we need to answer? And then the second, so that having all those in place and kind of, game playing, okay, this is our likely recall scenario. If we do have a bad day, here are the people we want to list and get on board. That way, if there is whispering of an issue, immediately you could just even send an email out saying, hey, heads up, we're seeing this. We may reach out to you. And then they get involved in the conversation early on. So mistakes aren't made that you're then later on trying to fix, right? Yeah. Which, unfortunately, when we pick up the phone and we do the internet thing at the, 3 days into the process, we're trying to go back and undo some of what we've done because maybe we navigated a different way than might have been optimum.
Yeah.
That's sort of the first bucket.
Yeah.
The second bucket is having those resources identified and in place so that when, if the issue is internal and the USDA or FDA says, okay, what's your root cause analysis? What are your corrective actions? You have that process authority or that microbiologist who can come in and do help you do an environmental sampling to see if you can find a resident organism or help identify maybe corrective actions for your systems to prevent reoccurrence in order for to give the agency enough assurance that they don't have to pull your registration or tell you that, tag your equipment and your products and say you can't ship anymore.
Right.
So there's the consequences depending on the issue of a recall, having all those people already in place and those resources, and even better, not necessary, but I recommend it, having had the opportunity to do introductions and have them learn about your business and your products and your system so they at least have a general background in advance. Yeah. So then when there is an issue, they can hit the ground running and everybody is, looking at an issue through the same lens.
Right. Yeah. So two really good points out of that is one of the other groups that you need to reach out to are your regulatory bodies. They need to know who you are in advance. So who is the district recall coordinator for FDA in your area? Nothing saying that you can't call them and introduce yourself. Work with the local agency so they have a comfort level with you and they know that you're a good player. Back to this recall scenario type situation, right? So back to box one, where we're trying to figure out where an issue is. And let's say that I'm the recall coordinator. I am under incredible pressure. Everybody is absolutely inundating me with requests and I'm getting data and I'm trying to figure stuff out. Is this real? We're talking with the team, talking with the CEO, trying to figure this out. Having an outside entity who is impartial and can provide expertise and advice and counsel relative to this is incredibly important because I'm in a state of panic, right? If I'm not able to control that, being able to call you up, Shawn, and say, hey, here's the issue that we've got. You can say, okay, Bryan, I need you to take a deep breath. Let's look at this. Let me ask you a few questions and then we'll move forward from there, right? And that allows me to recenter and be like, okay, yeah, you're right. Let's think about this. Because the absolute worst thing you can do in these type of scenarios is panic and become emotional relative to this and start running around with your hair on fire. You need those people who can support you and bring you back to that frame of reference where you're like, okay, yeah, this is something we need to figure out and let's do that now. Incredibly important.
Absolutely. And it's the having the resources and people who have the experience to just your point. This is not an issue I think we need to be worried about. And we can, put this in the category maybe of a quality issue and we're okay.
Yeah.
Or, what I'll typically say is if it's, a pretty serious issue, if FDA were sitting at the table with us, this is what they would say, right? Yeah. So we can have that sort of honest conversation. And I would also say that I don't think anybody should be scared by reaching out and getting all those resources in line. In many cases, like for us, for example, we don't charge any of our clients any retainer. We just are in the background waiting in case they need us, right? They pick up the phone. That's it. So there's no, and a lot of your scientists and the folks that maybe they're likely operate, in the same ways. Or if it is a retainer situation, I think of it as just insurance, right? Yeah. Having insurance in the background, just so that you've got the right people who are ready to go to help you in the event you have an issue.
Yep. So here's another piece of real world advice that I think a lot of people miss relative to this process is there's absolutely two key people you need to have on your team that people forget. The first one is you need to have somebody, if you're the recall coordinator, you need to have somebody with you at all times and at all locations, separate people who are taking notes. You don't want to have to do that yourself. You want a scribe by your side that says 9:15 a.m. on Tuesday, Bryan contacts Shawn, goes over some of the details of the case, talked about X, Y, and Z. Half hour later, a meeting takes place with the recall team, because trying to recreate that information after it ain't going to happen. And that log of information down the road is going to be absolutely critical for, number one, let's say that you have a court case associated with this, right? That log of activities is going to be gold for your food lawyer. And it also allows you then to go back after the fact and deconstruct that issue and figure out where things went wrong. Maybe you can figure out what you can do better in the future from that. The other key point, and then I'll get your comments on this as well, is you need to have a point of communications. So, for example, President Biden sends out his press secretary. So Corinne Jean-Pierre goes out and meets with the press and answers questions and these type of things. President Biden doesn't do that. It's the same situation here. If I'm the recall coordinator, I've got stuff coming at me left. I don't have time to be updating everybody. And if you don't have that point of communication who then disseminates information to different groups as you disperse it to that person, you're just going to be constantly answering questions from the CEO or the salespeople or FDA or the plant or whoever. You won't have time to do your investigation. So you need to have that position.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's also one of the benefits that can come from setting aside that half a day to do that recall exercise, where all of the important members of the team will be in the room. They'll be tested. The communication channels and who should be those individuals can be identified during that exercise, so that everybody, once you leave the room, knows their role and they feel pretty good about what they just did. Right. So absolutely.
Yep. So another key point here is transparency. Your communication with the public will make or break you. You need to be transparent on what's going on. So as we've seen recently, this whole big recall with applesauce for children's products, and they're thinking it's the cinnamon, and they've identified the manufacturer and things like this. The company has come out, some of the companies have come out relative to this recall and said, okay, well, it's not our fault. It's that supplier's fault. Rightly, Frank criticized them on Twitter and said, no, you are responsible for supplier approval and management as well. You cannot pass the buck, and shame on you for trying to pin this on your suppliers. And he's right.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely, I agree. And I think there's a sort of a spectrum. So if we're dealing with a issue that has can have a significant impact to public health, and the issue was preventable, and it was a supplier issue, I think the finished product manufacturer should stand up and take responsibility and say, listen, it's kind of like Boeing after they had the issue where the door patch blew off. It appears that one of the issues was a supplier, and the Boeing CEO said during a meeting to all of the leadership, which the notes were publicized, said, listen, this is our fault. Yeah, it was a supplier issue, but it's our fault, and it should never have happened, and it's our responsibility to make sure it never happens again. And that I think is important. There are, in sort of a nuanced way, maybe times where a company might give credit to a recall to one of its suppliers, and I think it's less. It's more okay if it's an issue that maybe dealt with something that was more of a quality type issue or less of a safety issue, where the company may say, listen, we've had some issues with some of our suppliers, and here's what we're doing to fix it. And we're moving, off to a different supplier. But I agree in the heart and context of, people getting sick or being harmed. That is the last time anybody should be blaming their supplier for something that they likely should have been able to identify and prevent.
Right. And so this is why it's so important to practice. And your messaging back to the public makes or breaks you. If you even get the slightest whiff, the consumers get the slightest whiff in your communications that you're saying, not my fault, right? They're not going to trust you, right? If you're able to go out there and say, yes, we've had these issues. The health of our consumers and our public is the highest priority for us. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're protecting you. And here's how we're going to prevent this from happening in the future. That's a completely different message. People will forgive. It's like, oh, okay, right. Mistakes happen. you have to be open and transparent relative to that. But to your point, these things are based upon the context of what that particular issue is, which is why you need to have these scenarios worked out in advance. So here's an interesting piece relative to this is FDA, state agencies, us, right? We're all people, and people make mistakes. And there's a phrase, confirmation bias. If someone has reached a conclusion, they will do everything that they can, and this isn't on purpose, to reinforce that decision. So if you are arrested for a crime and you're being investigated by the police and they think that you did it, they're going to pay attention to the evidence that supports their thesis and tend to subconsciously ignore the stuff that doesn't. And it's the same with regulatory agencies as well. If they believe that the recall is your fault, right, this particular scenario, everything that they do is going to reinforce that decision. And you may not be at fault. So you need to be very careful on these type of things. People go to jail over false testimony, right? This happens in criminal cases where you'll see this poor person who has spent 20 years in jail, and then DNA testing comes out and shows that they were innocent, and that 20 years is gone, right? That poor person. Testing labs make mistakes. I know this from personal experience. I was involved in a recall, and it ended up being false. And what happened, and the state never actually admitted to this, but what happened was there was another recall going on, and they cross-contaminated the samples or mislabeled the samples, or who knows what happened behind the scenes. And my company got caught up in the recall of this other company. And then the agency came back and said, oops, sorry, actually, you don't need to recall your product. Done, right? It's too late at that point in time. So we still had to pick up the mess, but the state messed it up.
Yeah, and I've seen over the course of my career many instances where the regulators have gotten it wrong. Long time ago, Whitewater in Florida, there was a meat packer that was accused by FSIS of causing a O15787 outbreak, and it ended up committed suicide, I believe. Oh. And it ended up being linked after the fact to a water park where the child who died was exposed, so it wasn't beef. We saw the fiasco with tomatoes that were, the outbreak believed to be associated with tomatoes. It was ultimately proven to be jalapeno peppers coming out of Mexico. I had a case a number of years ago involving Hy-Vee, another grocery store located in this case was in Iowa, and there was an outbreak associated with catering events. So the store would, on every Thanksgiving, would make turkeys, cook them in the store, and then send them out into the community. And there were about one of the recipients was a church that would then serve the turkey and Thanksgiving meals at the church, but then also repackage them and send them out into the community for people who were less fortunate or older or couldn't get to the church. And ultimately, about 300 cases were ascribed to the turkey that was either delivered by the church or served at the church. And the health department, who was in charge of the investigation, actually were friendly with the leaders of the church. And shortly after the outbreak was identified, these people getting sick, they announced publicly on the news that they had solved it, believing the source of the outbreak to be Clostridium perfringens in the turkey that was undercooked by the grocery store. But none of the data, none of the temp logs, nothing supported that conclusion. And then the health department was sending emails to their friends at the church saying, hey, great news. We've pinned it on Hy-Vee. It's not anything your church workers did. And what we found after lengthy discovery was that the state was also, this was at the county level, the state was also involved in the investigation. And the lead epidemiologist in the state believed that this was actually a norovirus outbreak. And no matter what she did, she couldn't find any evidence to support the hypothesis that the county had made that this is Clostridium perfringens from undercooked turkey. And the incubation periods didn't line up. The symptomology was off. It really looked like a norovirus outbreak, but the county stood by their words. And what we discovered in discovering the course of the case was the state was providing information in their supporting role to the county that was exculpatory, suggesting that HIV was not the source. And this was a norovirus outbreak, likely caused by a food handler at the church. And the county deleted all that information from the draft reports.
Wow.
Because it wasn't consistent with their hypothesis that they announced to the news while the investigation was still underway. And, things like it just, and there is countless evidence suggesting this was a norovirus outbreak, including when I deposed the head epidemiologist in the state of Iowa, and asked her about her investigation and her role and what she believed was the cause of the outbreak. She broke down in tears when I handed across the table another document that was buried, which was the test result from the individual, one of the individuals who died in the outbreak. And she had tested positive for norovirus, not Clostridium perfringens, when she arrived at the hospital 2 weeks before her death. And the lead epidemiologist broke down in tears and then pulled out all the draft reports that she had provided the county, which were deleted when they announced their conclusions, and was very thankful that finally the truth came to light. So do these things happen? Yes, they do. Let me just also say, most public health officials are very good human beings. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to protect the public health, and that's all of our goal. But when we're being accused of things, we have to always be sure that we're asking the right questions. We're making sure there is no bias or silo vision, and that the conclusions that are being made and the accusations that are being leveled are in fact true.
Yep. Perfect example of confirmation bias in action. And we're all people, we're all susceptible to it. And part of the defense against that is being aware of it. So always keep that in mind. Wow. So part of what I wanted to circle back on before we run out of time here, Shawn, is whole genome sequencing. Should companies do this or not? Oh, Shawn,
I lost you for just a second. So whole genome sequencing. Yes, the question.
Yeah. Should companies be doing this or not?
Yeah. So the way I describe this is, if we had a room full of food safety professionals and I said, would it be helpful for you, just generally speaking, to use WGS as part of your environmental monitoring program to basically put a uniform on the pathogens you're finding and see if you have any resident strains? Let's see a show of hands. I think everybody would raise their hand and say, yes, that would be a useful tool, and we could probably do a better job seeing what's in our environment and getting rid of it if we have to. But then when you ask how many people are willing to do it, all the hands go down, right? Because the perception, and frankly, it's real, is that the data generated from WGS could potentially be used against the company by an aggressive investigator to say, well, you've demonstrated through your own environmental monitoring program and the use of WGS that you have a persistent strain and it's been in your facility for 18 months. We're going to give you a warning letter.
Yeah.
Now what? Right? So, that's just one example of how, WGS data could be used against the company. I know the FDA, and I've had conversations with the agency about some of these issues and the concerns that exist. And there will be an effort over the next year or so to find ways to encourage companies to use WGS and get rid of some of these fears. I think there is a path forward to do that, but I think it's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of thought into helping us get to a place where companies can feel comfortable freely using it and then relying on that data. And, when we do it with clients, mostly, Bryan, we do it under the attorney-client privilege. So if they get a positive, we can send it off to, let's say, Cornell. We'll have the WGS run. The results will be reported, for instance, to me, and then I would share them with the company. So there's ways you can kind of still do it, but just doing it openly and then showing the FDA what your results are may not work out well yet.
Yeah. So yeah, having outside food counsel and understanding work product rule, super important. And Shawn can help you with that for sure. So we're really short on time here. So what I wanted to do was kind of summarize this in my notes relative to the recall scenarios. And what you need to be thinking about in your company for these is, number one, if you have a recall type situation, the number one rule here is it's never going to go as you think it's going to go. It's going to be close, hopefully, if you prepare, but it's going to go in directions you will not expect. So your system needs to be able to react and pivot with however that recall unfolds. The second one, your goal here is to protect public health, right? And that needs to be stressed over and over again within the organization, that this is why we're doing this, and this is our role of our objective. It's why we're in business. The truth the truth may be hard to find. And to your point earlier, right, this may not be your fault, and you may never find out what caused this. But you have to go back and be able to reconstruct those things and take valuable lessons and do a postmortem. Most companies fail on that. After the recall, you need to be willing to go back and say, okay, well, we got through this. Companies want to move on. You have to then go back and do a postmortem and say, what did we do well? What did we not do well? And how can we improve the system and our processes going forward so we never have to go through this again? You have to do that. And if I leave you with anything here from this, and hopefully this demonstrates with our chat here today, you have to prepare. Just doing traceability exercises, 2% of what you need to be doing relative to preparing for these scenarios. You have to have systems. You have to practice those systems. You have to have the resources in place. Any other closing thoughts from you, Shawn?
No, it's, from a very, very high level, the recall process seems like it should be a relatively straightforward and easy thing. But when you actually, get out on the battlefield, you find that it's very nuanced, can be very complex, and requires, really, it's a team effort, right? To make sure that we're getting to the right place for the right reasons and always doing the right thing. And if we can rely upon each other, to your point, most likely we're going to arrive exactly where we need to.
Yep, exactly. And to keep that battlefield scenario, a recall is fog of war. It's, you have limited information, you're not sure what's going on, and there's chaos. You need to be aware of that. And so that'll bring our chat to a close today. So Shawn, wow, we covered an incredible amount of territory in an hour. Shawn, if you can't tell, right, he's an expert in these things. And if you don't know Shawn, you need to build a relationship with him because he's incredibly valuable in these areas. So thanks for joining us today, Shawn.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It was a great talk as always.
Yep. And I want to thank everybody here on the chat too. Amazing comments, everybody. Thank you. I mean, this is why we do this, and the feedback and the input here from everybody on the call was great. So thank you for that. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your busy schedule once a week to join us and increase your knowledge on these subjects. So with that, we're going to close out our chat for this week. We'll be back here again next week at the same time, and we live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and I'll bring another awesome expert like Shawn on the chat. But in the meantime, enjoy your weekend. We appreciate all you do. Relax a little bit, and we will see you back here next week. So thanks again, Shawn, and thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks, Bryan, for being an awesome host.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.